let's be very clear before we go any further as to what this debate is not. Number one, this is not a debate about Angela Merkel per se. The proposition is not here tonight to attack her as a person, but only to attack, to critique, to reject her destructive policies, and by extension, I should add, the policies of pretty much the entire German establishment. Number two, when we say Germany or Merkel is, quote, destroying Europe, we're referring to the very visible, very undeniable damage being done to the economic and social fabric of countries such as Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland. And number three, this isn't a debate where we say Germany has no right to pursue its national interest. Of course not. Of course it does. But the question remains, is Germany's unflinching, unrelenting, all-consuming pursuit of its own national interest at all costs destroying the rest of Europe, particularly southern Europe? We believe it is. How so? Well, primarily through austerity, misguided, self-defeating austerity. Merkel and Germany's preferred solution to Europe's growth, debt, and jobs crises, i.e. cuts, cuts, and more cuts, has brought the continent to the edge of a second Great Depression. And today, under Merkel, Germany, for so long the driving force of Europe's growth, prosperity, unity, now finds itself isolated once again, loathed and feared in equal measure. Merkel did not cause Europe's financial crisis. That dishonor still belongs to the world's top bankers. But her deficit fetishism, her Hoover-esque obsession with balanced budgets and severe spending cuts helped produce the Eurozone's longest ever recession and continues to threaten to disrupt 6 decades of pan-European stability and unity. As we shall see tonight, her supporters argue that this is totally unfair. The Iron Chancellor, they believe, is standing up for hard-working Germans who are weary of having to bail out their feckless and profligate southern European neighbors. But this argument, ladies and gentlemen, is utter nonsense. Fecklessness? Figures compiled by the OECD show that, on average, the lazy Greek worker labors for 2,000 hours a year, which is more than 40% longer than the average German does. So a little less Schadenfreude, please. And as for profligacy, despite what Frau Merkel and her friends would have you believe, it has little to do with Europe's current crisis. Spain's downturn was caused not by excessive government spending or public debt, but by the wholly unsustainable growth in private debt, particularly in the financial, real estate, and insurance sectors. Thanks to the crash, Spain went from having one of the lowest public debt to GDP ratios in the entire Eurozone to one of the highest. So let's junk this overspending myth too. In fact, it's underspending. It's Merkel-prescribed austerity that is to blame for the current growth crisis, or I should say, lack of growth crisis. The results are in. Austerity isn't working, it has failed. In September, the unemployment rate in the Eurozone hit a record high of 12.2%. That's 20 million people. The situation for young people, meanwhile, is beyond dire. It's heartbreaking. Youth unemployment stands at 35% in Portugal, a mind-boggling 56% in Spain, a whopping 61% in Greece. This is a human tragedy, plain and simple. It's the willful destruction, yes, destruction, of an entire European generation. But Merkel won't budge. She's the chief purveyor of the very conventional wisdom that says an economy is like a household. It shouldn't spend or borrow beyond what it earns. But economies are not households, or credit cards for that matter. And common sense, if not basic macroeconomic theory, tells us that the solution to a downturn caused by a drought in demand is not to cut demand further by everyone slashing spending at once. History teaches us that the Great Depression wasn't helped by US President Herbert Hoover's austerity measures. And in pre-war Germany, it was mass unemployment, not hyperinflation, that propelled Hitler to power. Isn't it ironic that the leader of a nation understandably paranoid about and offended by any mention of its Nazi past seems so relaxed about the rise in recent years of anti-austerity, neo-Nazi, far-right parties across Europe, from Marine Le Pen's National Front to Greece's black-shirted Golden Dawn to the fascists of Jobbik, now the third largest party in Hungary. Merkel, however, prefers to fiddle, not just as Athens burns, but Madrid and Lisbon, and yes, Rome too. Ladies and gentlemen, in denial, indifferent to human suffering, bent on austerity at all costs, Angela Merkel is destroying the European project, pauperizing her neighbors, and risking a new continent-wide, if not global, Great Depression. She must be stopped. She must be sent a message. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to vote yes tonight. Send that message tonight. I beg to propose. Thank you very much.
60 years ago, in this very city in London, Germany came here after the war and got the following deal. Firstly, a haircut of her debt. Secondly, the Marshall Plan a huge investment plan. And thirdly, a condition that she would only pay back the bit of the debt that wasn't cut if she had good economic performance in terms of exports and growth. So what was decided in London 60 years ago? That there would be no return to the interwar period, that there would be no return to the recession. Germany would not be punished for the Second World War. We would not have a debt trap again. And we laid the foundations for the golden age of capitalism, of the welfare state, of social security. I will be very interested to hear from a historian of the Second World War why Germany was rightly not punished in 1953, but Greece should have been punished in 2010. Let me go back to the beginnings. How did we get into this crisis? We got into the crisis because people believed neoliberal rhetoric. They believed that if you liberalized everything, there would be growth, and everybody was told, borrow, because we'll have so much growth, you'll be able to pay it back. So they said to people, to firms, to households, to banks, to states, borrow. And when that didn't happen, when we didn't have that growth, and then when we had a crisis, what happened? Well, we had to discuss which contracts could we keep after the crisis. And what did Merkel impose on Europe and impose on Greece? That only one contract would we keep, the contract to debtors, to borrowers, to the people who'd lent to us. No other social contract. Not to our ill people who we promised that if you work hard, the state will be there to protect you. Not to our pensioners, where we promised that if you worked hard, the state would be there to help you in your pension. Not to our young people, that we said if you educate yourself, if you go to universities, there'll be a job for there. All those social contracts have been broken. They've been broken because Greece, Spain and Portugal have created a state that accept only one obligation to their creditors. Is that a future for Europe? Greece is, and now I'm appealing to your hearts as well as to your minds, because all these social contracts are broken, is facing a humanitarian crisis. I won't milk this. I won't tell you very many examples, but think of the lady who has to give up her cancer treatment. Think of a lighter example, a small accumulation, the granny who can't this year give any presents to the grandchildren. Think of that, what that does to a society, how people react into that in that society. We've been here before. We oppose Merkel, and we're struggling for a new democratic Europe because we know what happened when progressive alternatives failed in the 1930s. We know that there are always generals on white horses who are ready to come into the vacuum left by politicians who have abandoned every agenda on pensions, on wages, on the welfare state. I'm telling you that opposing Merkel is important, not just because of what she's doing, but what space she's creating for those generals and white horses. And we can start here together and say, and now I'm speaking more as an economist, as a professor rather than a politician, there is no law of social science that says that neoliberal capitalism is the only game in town. There is no economics law that says only the private sector and the market can respond to people's needs. The inequality within Western countries cannot last for much longer. The poverty in Western economies cannot last much longer. And if we do not do something, as we didn't do with Spain in 1936 and the failure in France in 1936, we know what the results were. The results were fascism and war. And we're close to that again. Bad things happen not only when bad people do them, but when good people don't stand up and stop them. Thank you very much.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.